On September 15th of the current year, that's 2022 if you came here from the future, I received a message on my LinkedIn account informing me that Tim Little, the Vice President of Engineering and Technology at Retro Studios in Austin, Texas, was quitting his job at Retro and moving over to Samsung. Here's the message in Tim Little's own words.
After 14 years at Retro and Nintendo, I have decided it's time to move on. I made many of the best games of my career there and worked with a lot of outstanding individuals. I will take a lot of great experiences with me. I look forward to getting back into a much more technical role as I join Samsung to work on their GPU team.
This is kind of a big deal, because Tim Little was one of the senior-most employees at Retro Studios, the celebrated video game developer currently working on the long-anticipated and long-delayed Metroid Prime 4. A year ago on September 16th of 2021, we, the CCP, published a video titled, "Retro Studios hasn't released a new game since 2014. We think we know why." In that video, we chronicled the celebrated history of Retro Studios in Austin and how it became one of Nintendo's most important subsidiaries, releasing an unbroken string of widely acclaimed games, starting in the year 2002 with the original Metroid Prime for the Nintendo GameCube. However, we also point out that over the last 7 or 8 years, as many of you know, Retro Studios hasn't produced a single new game, which has to be some kind of record for a major AAA studio. Our hypothesis is that a double-headed management structure and interference from Nintendo of Japan is detrimental to Retro's capacity to produce new video games, which in turn is harmful to the long-term careers of Retro's employees who need to have finished projects on their resumes in order to survive in the highly competitive video game industry. Supporting this, we discussed rumors about various aborted games and personal testimony from former Retro Studios employees that shed some light on what it's like to actually work for the company. Does Tim Little's recent departure from Retro Studios further corroborate our understanding of the situation? And is this a sign that once again, Retro Studios is embroiled in some kind of conflict, either with Nintendo of Japan or internally between members of its own staff? Maybe. But who is Tim Little? And no, he has no connection whatsoever to Tiny Tim.
Come tiptoe through the tulips with me.
At least, not as far as we know.
Tim Little is a software engineer who attended Texas State University in San Marcos in the 1980s. When the hair was big, the stadiums were jam-packed, and skateboards didn't all look like those boring tongue depressors at your doctor's office. The 80s was bitchin', and so was Tim Little, because he dropped out of Texas State and went straight to work in the computer game industry, which was beginning to flourish around the same time period thanks to rockin' pioneers like Richard Garriott, aka Lord British, dude. The guy who brought the Dungeons and Dragons out of the middle of the basement and over into the darkest corner of the family room with the Ultima series. In fact, Tim Little started off his own adventure in video game development at Origin Systems, also started by Richard Garriott and his brother Robert. And Tim wouldn't have to go far either, because Origin was in Austin, Texas, only about 30 miles north of San Marcos.
Wow, how convenient. After working at Origin for a year between 1992 and 1993, possibly on Ultima 7 or Wing Commander, Tim Little would start his own company called Charybdis Enterprises, which lasted from 1994 to 1999.
Charybdis? What in the heck is a Charybdis?
It's like a giant sea monster that's known for sucking.
And that's a good name for a company?
Probably not. Anyway, Charybdis produced various war sim games for the PC market, including a game in 1998 called Fighter Pilot, which I vividly remember seeing on store shelves, and I'm pretty sure I may have actually owned and played on my PC at one time. It's hard to say, because 1998 was a long time ago. And I am greatly thankful for that. Sadly, Charybdis folded,
probably because of the name, dude.
And Tim Little went on to be a senior staff engineer at 3DFX, for a couple of years. Then he worked at Nvidia. Then for a year and 7 months, he was the director of technology for Ion Storm in Austin, Texas, which was owned by Eidos at the time.
The dudes that made Tomb Raider.
This brought Tim Little back into the video game industry as a software engineer, where he worked on games like Deus Ex Invisible War and Thief Deadly Shadows. This was all short-lived, however, and so too was Ion Storm, which officially went out of business in 2005.
Didn't Ion Storm make Daikatana? That first-person shooter developed by Doom co-creator John Romero that sucked so bad that it basically single-handedly kick-started the YouTube career of JonTron?
Yeah, but that was in the year 2000. Thief Deadly Shadows came out in 2004, and that was actually a good game. Yet, despite the success, sometime around the commercial release of Thief Deadly Shadows, Tim Little went on to join Aegea, developing physics simulators for computer hardware. And then in 2005, he joined Midway Studios in Austin as a technical director for several years, wherein he worked on the game Black Site Area 51 for the PC, a first-person shooter where you get to shoot the monsters from Tremors while riding in a helicopter.
Epic, dude.
Yeah, it wasn't bad. But it was in October of 2008 that Tim Little finally found a long-term home with Retro Studios, taking over responsibility for software development and information technology for the company. From that time going forward, Tim Little is credited for working on the following games for Retro: Donkey Kong Returns in 2010 for the Wii,
Yes, definitely.
Mario Kart 7 in 2011 for the 3DS,
Cool.
Donkey Kong Returns 3D in 2013 for the 3DS,
Okay, alright.
Donkey Kong Tropical Freeze in 2014 for the Wii U,
Woo, yeah.
and finally, Donkey Kong Tropical Freeze in 2018 for the Switch.
Isn't that just the same game?
Despite coming to Retro late in 2008, he is not credited as having worked on Metroid Prime Trilogy, which came out in 2009. And as it's been many years since Retro Studios has published a new game, it's been just as long since Tim Little has acquired a new game credit for his resume. And indeed, at Samsung, he'll be working on developing GPU technology as opposed to working on games. So why did Tim Little leave Retro Studios after 14 years? The biggest part of his resume, and one of the most productive periods of his entire career. Let's entertain some possibilities. Why does anyone leave a good job at a successful company for any reason? One possibility is obviously the chance to have an even better job someplace else, with some combination of increased pay, increased prestige, or better quality of life. And that very well may be something that Samsung is offering him. Another possibility is that you need to be geographically closer to family, or your spouse might have goals in another city, or even country, that would require you to move. And of course, people leave jobs when they become dissatisfied with the place they work. Maybe they don't get along with coworkers. Maybe the environment is unpleasant or even harmful. Maybe the pay is too low, the hours too long, and maybe the work itself is just unfulfilling or uninteresting. And sometimes when you quit a company, it's because you've been asked to leave. Or you're on the verge of being fired anyway, and quitting voluntarily might be a way of either saving face or protecting your long-term career interests. We can rule some stuff out. Tim Little likely didn't leave Retro Studios because he needed to be somewhere else. He's now at Samsung in Austin, Texas, which is in approximately the same North Austin area as Retro. Indeed, they're about 4 miles away from each other. I think we can also rule out the possibility that his quitting had anything to do with the long-delayed Metroid Prime 4. Tim Little is not credited with working on any of the Metroid Prime games in the past, and his entire career at Retro was focused on the Donkey Kong Country games, and the contributions that Retro made to the 3DS version of Mario Kart. I'm pretty certain that since 2014, despite not releasing any new games for almost 8 years, Retro Studios has, in fact, at least been trying to finish some games other than Metroid Prime 4, which they took over from Bandai Namco in 2019, and there have been many rumors about what those games might have been. Most of these rumors are based on little more than hearsay or even sheer fantasy, but I think we know one thing for certain. Retro Studios seems to have been attempting another 3D platformer, most likely another take on the Donkey Kong series, and possibly as a true 3D experience as opposed to another 2D platformer with 3D graphics. In 2019, the same year Retro Studios restarted development on Metroid Prime 4, they also hired back Stefan Dupree, who was formerly the lead designer of Donkey Kong Tropical Freeze at Retro, before being lured away to work on the new Super Lucky's Tale game, a true 3D platformer produced by Playful Studios that aimed at kids and nostalgic millennials who remember the N64. In 2020, Retro Studios also acquired Mark Capers, another designer from Playful, who had also worked on both new Super Lucky's Tale and the original Super Lucky's Tale released back in 2017. Indeed, since 2019, Retro Studios has been hiring many different people, and according to the company's website, they are currently still looking for talent across virtually every single facet of video game production. I think it's very likely, based upon the hiring of former new Super Lucky's Tale game designers, that Retro is or was attempting a 3D platformer in the same vein as Super Lucky's Tale. And I think it's also very likely that if Tim Little was working on any project at Retro before he announced his departure for Samsung, then it was probably another game in the Donkey Kong Country series, or something very similar to it. 8 years ago, which, once again, is about as long as the last time Retro put out a new game, Tim Little posted a message on LinkedIn saying the following: "I'm looking for a graphics engineer and an experienced gameplay engineering lead here at Retro Studios. We have a lot of exciting things going on and top-notch talent to work with." But whatever exciting things Tim Little was starting to work on back in 2014 never came to fruition. 8 years later, a year after we made our original video about this exact issue, Retro Studios still hasn't so much as announced a new game or produced a working trailer for Metroid Prime 4. Could Tim Little's departure from Retro Studios then be related to this issue? It almost certainly has to be, though it's not entirely clear how. I'm not convinced that Tim Little is leaving Retro Studios primarily or exclusively for the chance at working on GPUs at Samsung. Typically when people chase a dream job, or they go after higher pay or prestige, they're willing to leap at opportunities that force them to relocate. Again, Tim Little has taken an engineering job at Samsung in Austin, a short drive from his former employer at Retro Studios. If the move was about better opportunities or exciting new avenues of personal growth and exploration, what are the odds that this would all be available to him just down the street? Literally. It's East Down Palmer, just past the Dutch Brothers Coffee. I used to live in that area, and it's not too hard to find. Thus, I'm inclined to think that either Tim Little was dissatisfied with Retro Studios, or that Retro Studios was in some way dissatisfied with him. And I doubt it's the latter, because after all, Tim Little was with Retro for 14 years. And if Tim Little was dissatisfied with his co-workers, or management was dissatisfied with him, then he would have left a long time ago. I think that more likely than not, he left because of Nintendo.
No, not Nintendo. Nintendo makes some of the best video games ever. Obviously, those dudes know how to party.
Yeah, I'm not so sure. Have you ever seen Nintendo of Japan's work environment, dude? I've seen banks and solicitors that seem to have a more vibrant and fun atmosphere than Nintendo of Japan. Now compare that to Retro Studios' massive toy collection in the 2000s, and tell me where you'd rather work.
It helps us be more efficient, helps us be focused, and helps us create the kind of content that we hope the players will really like.
Whatever you say, dude.
Anyway, since Retro Studios is a subsidiary of Nintendo, they have always been at the mercy of the Big N's capricious and often brash management decisions. Nintendo has shown in the past that they are more than willing to scrap years of other people's work on any given project if that project fails to meet their exacting scrutiny. For an example of this, look no further than Metroid Prime 4. Nintendo announced the project at E3 in 2017, which means the game was very likely already into production at that point. Then suddenly, in like January of 2019, Nintendo publicly announces that the game was inadequate and that the project would be given over to Retro Studios, who would then have to start development on Metroid Prime 4 all over, from the ground up. Can you imagine how crushing and frustrating that must have been for the team at Bandai Namco, who spent years of their life working on that version of the game? Well, from what I gather, this exact scenario has also happened to the staff at Retro Studios over the last 8 years, and perhaps multiple times. Maybe after having major projects start, then stop over and over again, due to what must feel like outsider interference, it's hard to want to go on after a certain point.
I'd probably want to leave too, dude. In fact, I quit. You hear that, Nintendo? You can't fire me. I'm out of here.
I get it. Nintendo wants to ensure that they consistently put out the highest quality product possible. The Nintendo way. It's that design philosophy that made them a monolith in the 80s. And it's that philosophy that has repeatedly saved the company over many decades of tumultuous shifts and changes within the video game industry. While almost all of the prime Japanese game companies from the 80s and 90s have either completely gone out of business or turned into little more than nostalgic shills, targeting middle-aged men like, well, myself. Hello there! Nintendo manages to remain at the forefront of the industry, both in terms of sales, quality, and even innovation. But you know, sometimes it's okay to allow people who work for you to fail a bit, or to finish something that isn't exactly the way you imagined it. After all, unless they're allowed that experience, how can they ever really improve? And how can anyone feel satisfied with their work if it never reaches any meaningful fruition? Creators need to know that projects they start for Nintendo will eventually become actual Nintendo games. Otherwise, what incentive is there to even start? If Nintendo doesn't just let go and allow subsidiaries like Retro Studios to breathe on their own a little bit, then they are risking the real possibility of strangling them and losing their most valuable of all assets, talented creative people who might otherwise be excited by the prospect of making games for a legendary company like Nintendo. Do I know this for sure? Is it certain that Tim Little or any of the other people we've talked about on this channel left because of Nintendo's obstructive management style? Of course we can't really say for sure, but for now, let it be known that this is our primary suspicion.
We're looking at you, Mario.
We love you, buddy, but you know, sometimes you just gotta I don't know, chill out, man.
Yeah, have a mushroom, dog.
So what do you all think about Retro Studios? A once glorious gem in Nintendo's crown of development teams. Why haven't they made a game in 8 years? And what is it you think they're doing right now? And will we ever see a working version of Metroid Prime 4? Or will it be cancelled? Let us know all of this and more in the comments.
And thank you all very much for watching.
Hey, I'm supposed to say that.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye now.